Welcome everyone to Awesome Truth, a wrestling book club. I'm your host, Steve Semino, and with me as always is my co-host, Walt Schwenk. Hey, Walters.
Hello, Steven. How's it going?
My friend, it is going very well. We are back and we have a guest with us today, Walt. We have an interview with an author. We love talking to authors. You've heard us on the last episode talking about Ringmaster, the Vince McMahon biography. And we have the author of Ringmaster with us today. Josephine Riesman is here to talk about her book.
Author talk on Awesome Truth. Let's do it.
Special guests chatting it up, talking about Vince. We can't stop talking about Vince. and here's more of it. Here's Josie.
No chance, so that's what you got. Up against a machine too strong.
We are so glad to welcome yet another acclaimed author to the show. She's the writer of Ringmaster, Vince McMahon, and the Unmaking of America, which has already cracked the New York Times bestseller list. Please welcome Josephine Riesman to the show. Josie, thank you for joining us on Awesome Truth.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here. Very eager to see what y'all make of this thing.
Yeah, so Vince McMahon is a popular topic on this podcast. I'm sure Vince McMahon is a popular topic on many podcasts these days.
Well, if you're in wrestling, I mean, not just wrestling, but certainly within wrestling, Vince McMahon has been a topic for 40 years now. Like, I was reading, for research for this book, I went back into the archives of the Wrestling Observer and other small forgotten newsletters that, thanks to archivists, have been scanned. And it's really amazing. Like, the way people are talking about Vince in 1983 is not dissimilar to how they talk about him now. Like, it was fans then and now going, this guy has no idea what he's doing. He's going to wreck the industry. He's imperious. He doesn't listen to anyone. He's a threat to the very art form of wrestling. Like, people were saying this in 83 when he had just taken over the company, and it's still the topic of conversation. You know, the only thing that's changed is now people say he's lost his touch, as opposed to back then when people said he's trying new things that are completely anathema to what wrestling should be. So, you know, anyway, sorry, I went off on a tangent there, but you're in good company for the ages when it comes to discussing Vince McMahon.
Well, let's talk about, you mentioned like going into the archives. And I mean, we've read and learned and talked a lot about Vince McMahon in the 5-6 years that we've done this, both casually and for the podcast. But I mean, the first few chapters of the book, you really dove deep and very journalistically just uncovered people from this guy's past that I would have never thought of existing, childhood friends and people from his military academy that had different opinions. And I'd love to, let's start with that. Just learning more about you going and talking with these people, finding these people, like from.
I was a journalist. What do you want from me? I'm a journalist and historian. I did my job. If other people don't do their job, that's not my fault. You know, you cold call people. You look through obituaries to see who's listed as obscure family members, and you try and go. I mean, look, every journalist should, if you have the spare scratch, and it's not that expensive, it's just a monthly subscription, you should have a subscription to Spokio. I mean, maybe this technology will evaporate by the time this podcast comes out. You never know with tech, but Spokio or whitepages.com have premium products where you can just find people's phone numbers, aka what you used to be able to do and have always been able to do with the white pages, but which my generation, the millennial generation, sort of, a lot of us as journalists completely forgot that entire art, or maybe we were never taught it. But where I came up in newspapers and magazines, you call people. So a lot of it was, and you check your facts and go through the archives of data. I mean, that's the essence of journalism, is going through recorded data, whether it's verbal of, you know, whether it's words or numbers, and then talking to people and going to places. That was the other thing, was I went to North Carolina. You know, I went to the back roads and the small towns and the rural areas where Vince grew up in North Carolina. And when I got to those places, and even before, when I was talking to people to lay the groundwork, people from those places, the universal response was, oh, we've never seen Vince. Like, Vince never came back, you know. most of these people,
Right.
the vast majority of them, it was the first time anyone had ever asked them about Vince. One of his childhood friends, his best friend in 6th grade, a guy named Shell Davis, who I found, who still lives in Weeksville, North Carolina, where they spent time together when Vince was living there. He watched wrestling and knew who Vince McMahon was. And when I called him up, it was the first time he'd ever heard that Vinnie Lupton, the kid that he had hung out with in 6th grade, was the guy he'd been watching on television. You know, so it's not like it's easy, but it's pretty straightforward. You look through archives to find names and you call up those names. And when you call up those names, you ask for more names and you ask for the location of archives. You know, you keep rolling like that.
Well, Josie, that raises a great point that I want to touch on. My next question is there you know, as Walt said, we've been doing this show forever. We've done 150 episodes. There hasn't really been a Vince biography like this in a very long time. There was Sex, Lies, and Headlocks 2 decades ago, and no one has really touched this. But it's this iconic, massive, complicated figure in wrestling, and no one is, like you said, people aren't doing the homework that you did, which is not easy, but it's so important to this story. Why do you think no one else has undertaken the Vince McMahon biography at this point?
It's very easy to explain. Mainstream outlets don't take wrestling seriously as a product, so they think the process of making it, the industry, must be silly and beneath their attention. And then wrestling people who actually write about wrestling, a lot of them are very frightened to write about Vince, because if you're within the wrestling ecosystem, you have to defer to Vince to a certain degree, you know, and if you don't, you're one of the few, and those few get locked out. Or, you know, even if you say things about Vince that are disparaging, it's always sort of within a realm of what's allowed for wrestling journalism or wrestling journalists if they're just tweeting or whatever. You know, there's a certain kind of thing that you don't bring up most of the time, such as the rape allegation from Rita Chatterton, or the pedophilia ring, or the alleged sexual assault on the tanning salon employee in Boca Raton. You know, all of these things that, think about Dark Side of the Ring. I love Dark Side of the Ring. I love Dark Side of the Ring.
Mm-hmm.
But Dark Side of the Ring is an entertainment product that has to obey certain strictures in order to, I mean, they show WWE footage. I don't know how that works, but either they're licensing it, in which case they have to be careful, or they're doing fair use, in which they have to be even more careful because WWE could sue at any time. So my point is, Dark Side of the Ring also has constraints, you know, because it's within that wrestling ecosystem, and it needs to maintain good relationships with talent at AEW. I'm not even faulting them. I'm just saying this is how the industry works. I was lucky enough that I'm working in a print medium and already or a text medium, I should say. You don't have to read in print. And I have an existing track record from outside of wrestling. Perhaps the double-edged sword of me not having watched wrestling in 20 years as of when I started working on this book is I had to play a lot of catch up. And I'm sure there were things I missed because I could not watch, you know, not just those 20 years worth of wrestling, but from before I started watching wrestling,
right.
You know, 30 odd years of wrestling, couldn't watch everything. So the downside of it is that I was behind. But the upside of it was I was not beholden to anybody, and I had no preconceived notions beyond what I had as my teenage delusions. You know, I had not been the trouble with a lot of the wrestling ecosystem for media is people just hear rumors so often that they assume they must be true, or just take them as granted assumptions. And again, the advantage of me coming from a bit from outside is I hadn't gotten used to those rumors. If I saw some piece of information that people were tossing around that sounded dubious to me, I didn't have the weight of like experts for years telling me it's true. I just went, that sounds ridiculous. That can't be true. You know, for example, my favorite example, the idea that the wrestling crowds prior to the death of kayfabe generally all believed that wrestling was real. This is this weird myth that as soon as you start to poke at it, doesn't make any sense. There's zero chance that that was the case. Not only had wrestling been exposed in the media multiple times earlier in the 20th century, so that information was sort of had entered the meme sphere of knowledge, but also if you just you interview people who watched wrestling back then, and they will tell you, I mean, not everybody, there certainly were people who believed it was all on the level, but a lot of people were watching it despite, or perhaps even because of the fact that it was fake. And that's just like, you watch the official organs, or at least the allowed organs of media in wrestling to talk to you, and very often you'll completely miss that. I could keep going, but I'm rambling.
One of your best observations. I thought that was one of your best observations of the book, is you're saying the wrestlers are the ones who wanted to believe that everybody believed. Like it's a self-sustaining organism. They just convinced themselves that it was necessary, when in reality,
and then the fans were too reverent towards their heroes to say, hey, I know that was fake tonight, you know.
Or they were having fun, if you want to be optimistic. They were just enjoying themselves at the show.
Totally.
We just play along, you know, we're the crowd.
Totally. You know who told me that? Who gave me that first sort of thought that I was right about that was Dave Meltzer, of all people.
Yeah.
I interviewed Meltzer extensively for this, largely so I could get historical perspective on what it was like to be alive and experiencing this stuff. Because that's the essence of what I try to do with my books, is I write biographies so far, but what I try to do is situate you and say, okay, what did people actually know or believe about the world at the time? What was the visceral experience of living through that time and that place? And for wrestling, people like Meltzer, older journalists, were a huge asset. I don't always trust what they say in terms of facts, but they were observant watchers of both the product and the culture around the product. And even if they were not really very successful in their career lifetimes, I tried to honor as many of them as I could in this book, to be like, these were the people who were paying attention. And if we don't listen to them, we're doomed to repeat history over and over again, which we have been.
Yeah, it's funny you say that too, because like growing up in the 90s and like being a wrestling fan in the 90s, like there's the Vince McMahon that I grew up with as like the broadcaster, and then
the announcer.
And then obviously in hindsight, not like learning, oh, he actually runs all this. Even at times for me, like reading your book or reading or listening to podcasts or watching a documentary, it's like sometimes even just putting myself in the shoes of that 10, 11-year-old kid, I'm like, it's hard for me to be like, oh wait, he was the puppet master back then, and it was dastardly. It's like, no, he's just the broadcaster. So it's like uncoupling those ideas,
uncoupling those things. I know, and that was, again, I think that was a little easier for me because I hadn't been spending the previous 20 years in Vince's reality bending machine. It's not like I'm saying wrestling fans who did watch are idiots. I'm not saying that, although of course there are plenty of idiots out there in any population. What I'm saying is Vince is very good at manipulating your sense of reality. That is what has gotten him so far. He's very good at planting lies beneath other lies, so that when you and next to truths, so that when you dig up a lie, you think, oh, I found buried treasure. This must be the truth. You know, he figured out before most people that your method of storytelling in wrestling, and now this is true throughout the entertainment and political world and financial world, your product is not the only product. You also have to use the channels of media, of like journalism and new media and transmedia and social media, all of these things. These are equally, if not more important than the core product, because they are what gives the core product context enough that you actually want to watch. And so when you have those other streams, the tricky thing is you can plant lies much more easily in those other streams and have people believe that they're true, because you sort of siloed off the core product and said, we all know this is fake, right? You silo off the core product and say this is all fake, but then it's sort of left for you to assume that everything else you hear is real, which is of course not true. Have you watched these documentaries that he puts out? They're
too
all
many of them.
Yeah. We watched a lot of them, so we know those. Can't see the air quotes, Josie, you just did, but there's certainly air quotes around the word documentary.
Yeah. Listeners, I put strong air quotes around the second time I said documentaries, because they're actually great filmmaking for what they are. I think they're beautiful. They're beautifully shot. They can be very powerful. I thought the Kofi Kingston 24, where he goes back to Ghana, was one of the most interesting pieces of wrestling media that I've ever seen. But the reason that one's so interesting is because the WWE doesn't have any real interests in Ghana. So they can kind of make a travel doc about like Kofi Kingston going home to Ghana. But when you are telling the story of like the frickin' Undertaker, Mark Calloway, The Last Ride, you're just gonna like gloss. I mean, for Christ's sakes, WWE and A&E put together a documentary on China. They decided to whitewash the story of China and their involvement in it. It's insane.
Yeah. They just when you're a monopoly, when you run the show, you can do whatever you want. Like you said, when you
want. Even though AEW has a foothold in the wrestling world, WWE is so much bigger than just wrestling. It's this huge media empire, and it does have a monopoly on one thing. Even though you have AEW making it less of a monopoly on the simple wrestling product, AEW doesn't own any tape libraries other than its own.
And ROH now, but I mean, that's like the smallest potatoes in the world.
Yeah, ROH, yeah, whatever. But I'm just saying, like,
drop in the ocean.
CM Punk from 15 years ago, exciting.
Right, but I'm saying, like, they don't have the history of wrestling prior to whatever cutoff date, you know. But WWE does. You can't show footage of world-class championship wrestling, you know, the Von Erichs Texas territory, unless you get Vince's permission, even though those guys hated Vince's guts. It's insane. You can't tell an honest story using footage from the territories, really, because that footage is all owned by WWE, and they're going to have conditions about how you present it.
Yep, and that ties into something that you talked about in the book is Bret Hart and Bret Hart's matches and the choices Bret Hart made to ultimately return to work again for the man who screwed him over and killed his brother and ruined his life, because he wants his own legacy to be well maintained, available out in the world. And that's why everybody comes back to some extent to Vince, because he either owns your history or he owns your future, and there's no real opportunity to do anything but return.
Yep.
Which is very depressing.
I mean, I say this in the book, there's a 3-word credo that defines wrestling that every wrestler learns: protect the business. And Vince made himself synonymous with the business. So you have to protect Vince. It was a genius maneuver for holding on to power, because not only does he have the financial power, but he owns the narrative power. And that was what brought Bret back. And that's the thing. That's what's so amazing to me about this Cody storyline right now, the like finish the story, the endless finish the story thing. It's so funny to me because Vince McMahon owns that story. Vince McMahon owns the story of the Rhodes family at this point for the most part. Yeah. Like, it's terrifying. And he doesn't get to finish that story unless Vince lets him, which is true of all of the wrestling stories these days that had a healthy part in WWE. Where, like, yeah, I mean, I interviewed Lanny Poffo, the late Lanny Poffo. I put parts of a big chunk of the interview in my zine, the Ringmaster zine, which you can find at my at the book website, ringmasterthebook.com. And he was talking about his decision after Randy Savage's death to allow Randy to be inducted into the Hall of Fame, which Randy had said, I'm not going, you know, before he died, he said, I'm not going in unless the entire Poffo family is in there, including my dad, who he loved very much. And at the end of the day, Lanny said yes posthumously, because, I mean, he said it was because of the fans, but really, I think a lot of it, I'm sure there was some monetary amount involved, but also I think a lot of it really is Lanny recognizes the truth, which is if you're not in the WWE Hall of Fame, you're nobody. Like, not you're nobody, but like there's a huge asterisk on your significance. Like there's a huge question mark or whatever. To have the solid status of being a legend, you have to be in the WWE Hall of Fame. And he sort of saw that for Randy. It was like, if Randy's not in there, he's not in there. And I don't think that was, you know, you can debate over whether that was a moral choice, but it's a fact that he was reckoning with.
Yeah, there's a certain point where I think you have to be realistic, and grudges are what they are, and frustrations certainly exist as they rightly should. But Vince, to I think there's no, I don't know if shame is there's no shame, but there's certain clarity to saying like, okay, Vince is the boss, and like you said, he owns Macho Man Randy Savage for better and worse, and for we're like David fighting against Goliath, but Goliath's got like Transformers armor on and is unstoppable, like too big to fail. So what are you to
but
do?
He'll die someday. I'm not saying
No,
that as like a joke, but like
let's hope everybody does eventually, right? Let's
right. I mean, it may
that
be long
sticks.
from now. In that Vince's mom, Victoria Hanner, lived till 101. She died last year. But like the point is, he can have it, but he can't take it with him, and he's alienated his family to a crazy degree at this point. That's the interesting thing, is what will wrestling be like when the Vince McMahon era actually is over? Like, I remember when he stepped back, quote unquote, back in the summer, the Washington Post reached out, a great editor there reached out to me and said, hey, can you write something? She doesn't know anything about wrestling. She just read the news and knew I knew about wrestling, and said, do you want to write about the end of the Vince McMahon era? And I said, only if you can let me write about how it's not the end of the Vince McMahon era, because he hadn't given anything up, really. He was still the ultimate financial power at that company, which is the most important thing in America. Are you the ultimate financial power at an entity? And that was what he was. He was still the principal shareholder, and he still controlled 80% of the shareholder votes. He could do anything he wanted. And I said in the column, I'm like, he's very likely going to be back, or at least he could come back anytime he wants. And then sure enough, here we are. But I don't know what the world after Vince will look like. I think wrestling is going to survive. I say this, I sort of imply it in the end of the book, but like, I'm actually very optimistic about wrestling. Like, I think as an art form, wrestling is going to survive the apocalypse. Like, whenever that comes, whatever the social collapse looks like, wrestling is such a low-tech, ancient form of entertainment. And it's so held in such holy regard by so many Americans, Japanese, Mexicans, and people around the world, that I think it's got, even after the grid goes down, you can put down a mattress in a backyard, invite some of your friends, and you can have a pro wrestling match. It's amazing. It's a beautiful art form. I love it.
I love that sentiment, and that is very true. For better or for worse, wrestling will never leave us.
I think wrestling's never going to die. Like, pro wrestling, the staged wrestling, I really think has a long shelf life on it, because Americans love, not just Americans, but speaking for myself and my countrymen and women and people, we love spectacle and we love storylines, and pro wrestling can deliver that better than anything else, better than any quote unquote real sport. It was really interesting doing this book, because it really forced me to re-engage with my love of wrestling. And what I found was my love of wrestling actually has very little to do with the physical action. My favorite part of wrestling, and this was true when I was a kid, and this helped me sort of remember that this was what was true of me as a kid, was, for me, it was the theatricality. You can come into wrestling as a kid, either as a sports kid or a musical theater kid. And I was very much a musical theater kid. I started watching wrestling because it was over the top, and it showed the darkest human emotions and the brightest human emotions turned up to maximum volume, and the physical action I've never really gotten a taste for. Most of the time when I watch wrestling now, now that I don't have to be analyzing matches for the purpose of the book, I tend to just not pay attention to the visuals, and I just listen to the stream of commentary. The stream of commentary and promos and interviews is so interesting to me. And people don't pay nearly enough attention, especially to the commentary. But the commentary, Vince knew very well, was essential to mind control, because that's why he left himself as the announcer for so many years. He knew he could put people over or undermine them according to his whim and without a mediator. And the commentary remains, even if you're not paying close attention to it, it's subconsciously prompting you on a lot of stuff. And I just find it fascinating. Like Michael Cole and JR, whatever you think about their relative merits as human beings or even as professionals, I could not do what they do. I could not talk impromptu with Vince yelling in my ear for 2 to 3 hours or plus if it's a pay-per-view, trying to call a match and just keeping the audience entertained without breaking kayfabe while reinforcing all the storylines that I have to reinforce. wrestling commentators are a wonder to me. I find them fascinating.
It is amazing. They never mess up once, too. You think eventually
very rarely. You listen, and like when
but...
they do, it's very startling.
Yeah.
Because usually it's this just smooth, uninterrupted flow of semi-meaningless words, you know?
Yeah.
They are very meaningless.
With Vince in their ear for hours on end, when things are going well, just can't imagine what it looks like when
things are going badly.
Yeah.
I know. Crazy. Like one of my great frustrations was I had difficulty because for various reasons constructing the exact chain of events on the night Owen died. But because Vince was wrestling that night, he might not have been the one on the headset telling JR what to say. So I haven't been able to determine it. But like that level, the Owen Hart over the edge thing is one of the most amazing demonstrations of Vince's sheer control of that organization, because Owen falls, and I can't remember the exact amount, but it's like 6.5 minutes later, they're back on track. And he made the executive decision to, I mean, whatever the chain of events of who was talking to who, Vince was the one who made the decision. The crowd is not to be told that Owen is dead because the show must go on. I mean, I don't even know what it would be like now because everyone would have a cell phone. It'd be a completely, a smartphone. It'd be a completely different experience. But 99, the crowd keeps cheering along because they assume it's like a Jerry Maguire moment where somebody got injured and carted out and he'll be fine.
It's wild. There's so many wild stories in this book that, again, you approach with that journalistic, as Walt said, viewpoint. And I think that's so important because wrestling is ridiculous and it is its own world in and of itself. And having someone with that external perspective come in and highlight the foibles, to say the least, and the crimes and misdemeanors, to say the most, is always appreciated from our end a ton, because it's necessary. The internal world eats itself, and people outside can have some clarity that the internals cannot. So
thank you. I really appreciate that. I do want to make sure that everybody reads the acknowledgments, because I shout out a lot of the people who are on the inside who were extremely helpful. I am not trying to say I'm better than these people at all. I just want to clarify. We have different constraints on our journalism, and we have different media environments that we've spent the last 20 years in. So just to reinforce, I love good wrestling journalists. Bad wrestling journalists, I could take or leave. But the good ones, there are a substantial number, have really been huge trailblazers without whom I would not have been able to write this book.
Absolutely. That sounds very, very true. The book is Ringmaster, Vince McMahon and the Unmaking of America. It's a treat. We've declared it as such an awesome truth. And Josie, thank you for coming on and talking to us more about it. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Ringmasterthebook.com. You can find out more.
There you go. You heard it here, folks.
No chance in hell. You've got no chance. No chance in hell.
That was great. Josie is delightful. The book is Ringmaster, and you should read it right now, especially given the state of everything. We've talked about it a million times. We've talked about it in nauseum. It's a wonderful look at Vince, and Josie was delightful to chat about it.
Yeah, it was great to talk to Josie. I would love to say it's great to finally close the book on Vince McMahon.
Yeah, you think it's the last time, Walt? You think we'll never talk about it?
Yeah, the end.
All done.
Until the next big development in the Vince McMahon, the never not interesting Vince McMahon saga. I think we're good for a while, at least.
It is great creating content for like having episodes, but it is exhausting in that you said it is endless. So it's a mix of both.
Yep.
Well, if you want to hear more about Vince McMahon, all of our episodes on him, including the episode on Ringmaster, Josie's book, you can find our archives at awesometruth.libsyn.com. You can subscribe to us, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. Everywhere podcasts are delivered, we are there for new episodes and old. And you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at awesometruthpod. Well, delightful to talk Vince. Delightful in quotes, as always. Vince is Vince, as you said. And we'll be back to talk more Vince someday. Never doubt that.
Possibly in our next watch along.
Quite possibly. We'll see. I'm sure he'll come up to some extent. He always does.
Yeah, I think I'll make an appearance potentially.
Yes. Thank you all so much for listening. And remember, the truth will set you free.